Everyone knows someone who doesn't have a filter. You know about the filter, right? It's usually located somewhere between the brain and the mouth. Some people's filters, I think, are knit a little more closely together than other people's. And when it's working properly, it keeps us from saying things we think that we shouldn't say. Most folks, I think, are born with one. Sometimes they get damaged, though. Life has its seasons, and the filter doesn't always make it through some of those. Some people don't have one at all. You may know some folks. You may be one of these folks who commonly says, I don't have a filter. We might say that James chapter 3 is inviting us to ask the question, how's your filter? How is that aspect of your life that relates to the control of your tongue? Are you one to control your tongue, James would ask us? Do you desire to, but find it difficult? Or do you not worry? Do you not care? Do you just say whatever you think? For better, for worse, regardless of how it might impact different people. In truth, James's concern extends beyond the filter too, doesn't it? Because all of us, no matter how good our filter is, have had times in life where we have been susceptible to temptation. Someone has hurt us, and we want to give them a piece of our mind. Someone has said something to us, and we're going to let them know. We're going to get them back. We're hurt, and we know how to hurt. It's easy when we're on the active side to forget that filter or simply to try to vindicate ourselves. And it's easy when we're in that mode to forget what it feels like when someone else has turned those painful words on us. We know from experience that words have power, don't we? Whoever said, you remember the rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me? They must not have talked to many people. We know how painful our words can be. And even though we experience that pain, it's still stunningly difficult, and James recognizes the stunning difficulty of actually taming our own tongues. We feel justified in lashing out with our words. Our tongues, our vocal cords are able to do great damage. We've learned that from experience, whether it's inflicted or on us or by us. Now, this matters, particularly in the context of the church, because the character of our speech is directly related to the credibility of our gospel. The character of our speech is directly related to the credibility of the gospel. Think about it this way. Maybe you know some folks like this. This is not the time to kind of look around the room. You know someone, maybe you work with them, maybe you go to school with them, where like they go to church and they say they're a Christian, but you hear how they talk about people behind their backs. And you think to yourself, like, I thought Christians were supposed to embody kindness. And there's that passage about love, joy, kindness, generosity, like all those things. Isn't that what Christian character is supposed to look like? But I hear how this Christian speaks about people. Do you think that person has any credibility when it comes to the gospel? The character of our speech is directly related to the credibility of our gospel. And so James pulls out all the stops, doesn't he? He comes full force in this passage because he knows how powerful our words are and how we, in the way we speak, will either commend the gospel or not. We'll either commend the gospel or we will detract from it. And so James offers us counsel, doesn't he? On the nature of speech, the power of words, and what it looks like to tame the tongue. The crucial piece is the link with the gospel. If James could stand before us as we hear his words echo through Scripture across the centuries, I think he would reiterate to us what emerges from this text. Holding the tongue is better than hindering the gospel. In every case, in every instance, holding the tongue is always better than hindering the gospel. Now, James sets this out initially by highlighting the disproportionate power of the tongue. It's small, but mighty. Here's this tiny little part of our bodies that we really probably don't even think about very often. It's in our mouths most of the time, hidden away. You don't always see other people's tongues. You'll notice eye color, but here's this small part of our bodies. And yet it has power that's massive. It's able to build up. It's able to tear down. So the tongue has influence and power disproportionate to its size. And James, you may have noticed James likes illustrations, and he offers these little images all through this letter. Think about a horse with a bit in its mouth. Some of you may be horse riders. Tiny little piece of metal, but without it, it's very difficult to get this very large animal to go where you want it to go. And so if you want to direct this powerful creature, you need a bit. And the power and influence of the bit is disproportionate to its size, isn't it? James says it's like that. Or think of the rudder on a ship. Massive ship pushed along by wind in its sails. And there's this one small piece that's really small compared to the whole thing. Underwater, you can't even see it most of the time. And without it, you can't direct the vessel. Its influence, its power is disproportionate in relation to its size. Or a forest fire, James says. Think of a match. You got Smokey the Bear in your mind. If you're lazy with that one match, you can take down a whole forest. So there's all kinds of things in our lives, and James wants to remind us of this, that their power is disproportionate to their size. Small things have large consequences, don't they? And James wants us to think of our tongues like that. Think of your mouth, your vocal cords, your tongues as a small part of your body that we don't always think about that carries significant power and influence for better or for worse, for good or ill. To the extent the power of this thing, it sometimes feels absolutely impossible to control, doesn't it? I think most of us have probably been in a setting where we felt unable to control the words coming out of our mouths. And James gets that, doesn't he? I mean, he straight up says it. Verse 8, no one can tame the tongue. It feels absolutely impossible. I mean, something happens and I get angry. Remember, my last name's O'Reilly, which means I'm from Ireland. But used to have more red hair than I do now. That whole like redheaded Irish stereotypical thing. This resonates. Someone says something or something happens or someone cuts us off in traffic and we just feel this rage and this frustration and forget the filter, like we're angry. And we don't even pause to think, should I say that or should I not? We just say it. Forget who gets hurt. Like that's the point. I want to hurt somebody with what I'm about to say because I'm mad. James says, who can tame the tongue? It feels impossible when we're gripped with that desire to vindicate ourselves verbally. And yet, the fact that he's teaching on it implies the possibility for growth and improvement and discipline and grace-empowered Christian growth. Because after he says, no one can do it, he also says, this ought not be so. And he's writing to help the church, first century and 21st century, live into what's best and avoid this destructive posture of the untamed tongue. So it feels impossible, but the scriptures themselves are an instrument of God's grace to help us have sanctified speech. Speak holy words instead of destructive words. Words that are on fire with the Spirit of God, not words that cause forest fires. And it's important because the way we use our speech frequently reveals something about our hearts. You'll remember that Jesus said, out of the mouth comes the overflow of the heart. And sometimes we'll kind of say something and we'll couch it like it's in jest. You know, it's a joke. We can get away with it if it's a joke. But it's inside that joke is a barb. Out of the mouth comes the overflow of the heart. And we'll find cunning ways to hit someone with our words and make it sound socially acceptable. But there's a connection. The way I speak to this person or that person reveals the posture of my heart towards this person or that person. So this is big stuff. This matters. And it's very rarely do we talk about the sin of certain kinds of speech. Like we've got our big sin lists, like the prominent things that most of us are pretty good at avoiding most of the time, I think. You know, like murder or something like that. But when was the last time we actually spent some time reflecting on the sin of an untamed tongue? Not a frequent sermon topic, I think. And yet it directly relates to our heart. It directly relates to our ability to credibly proclaim the gospel. And it's deeply, deeply, deeply part of our growth in relationship to Jesus and the health of the church. James understands these things, and so he offers it to us in this way. He applies it in a couple of different areas. He starts with teachers. Bad news for people like me, right? Pastors, perhaps Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and you're probably thinking, well, I was needing a good excuse not to be a small group leader. Now I have one. Because James says not many of you should be teachers, right? That doesn't mean no one should do it. And it just means that the people we deploy in that role should be properly equipped And that's why Christ Church has created structures and spaces to equip folks to lead and teach, and you can learn and you can get strategies for helping coordinate those kinds of groups, because the groups are crucial to the life of the church. And without leaders, we can't have that crucial element. So, but we want to do it well. We don't want to turn you loose unequipped. And so the team, staff, and laity work to create qualified facilitators. James says this matters because there's a higher level of accountability. Because teaching gone wrong can be disastrous for the life of the church, can't it? In the first century, teachers were quite prominent in society. They carried a lot of influence and were seen as prestigious persons. And so you can imagine that some people would want to become teachers for the wrong reasons, or so that they could wield influence for whatever their agenda might be, or so that other people would just defer to them or appreciate them. Like their hearts are in the wrong place. In 2 Corinthians, the entire letter is written because there's a competitiveness between some teachers and Paul. Paul planted and cultivated the Corinthian church, and then at some point, these guys came in. He actually calls them super apostles. That's a literal translation of the term. Super apostles. You probably never met one of those. But they come in and they're rhetorically trained and classically educated, and they're put together, and they give a good speech, and they're erudite, and that's the kind of pastor you want, isn't it? And Paul's over here, and the Bible doesn't tell us what Paul looked like, but there's some sources from the 2nd century that tell us he was short, bow-legged, and had a unibrow. So put that guy up against the super apostles, and the Corinthians give us those guys every day. Paul's not very impressive. And Paul has to remind, there are these teachers, and there's this competitiveness, and you can see how the church is maybe tempted to lean into the more respectable type of clergy. And Paul has to remind them that the gospel doesn't run through society with the intuitive means. God uses unlikely people to proclaim the gospel. Jesus picked blue-collar fishermen. God rescued a group of slaves from Egypt and made them his representatives. But that role of prestige in teaching is what created the competitiveness in Corinth and divided the church. In 3 John, we don't get to 3 John much, do we? We'll go there today. In 3 John, we learn about a guy named Diotrephes. And John says in verse 9, there's only one chapter of 3 John, so you just have verses, no chapters. I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So here's a guy who's seeking leadership, teaching perhaps, but he doesn't acknowledge apostolic authority. Verse 10, so if I come, I'll call attention to what he's doing in spreading false charges. So he's teaching things that are wrong, slandering the apostles, teaching false charges against us, and not content with those charges, he refuses to welcome the friends, the gathering of the church. He even prevents those who want to do so and expels them from the church. So here's a person who's kind of stepped into this leader-teacher role and is creating all kinds of divisiveness. So that's why James wants to say, teachers, there's a higher level of accountability because the impact of divisive teaching or false teaching is detrimental to the life of the local church. And so that really matters. And so we want to build structures that help teachers emerge and get equipped and do that job well. And we might be thinking, well, that's great. All this stuff about taming the tongue is really about the preacher, not the rest of us, right? That's good news, isn't it? Except James doesn't let us off that easily, does he? Because in the next verse, verse 2, he says, all of us. And when he says all of us, you know what he means, right? He means all of us. Like none of us are excluded. We are all included. So there's a special word to teachers about the responsibility. And then there is kind of an inclusive, exhaustive statement that all of us are liable to using our tongues in ways that are destructive to other people and the advancement of the gospel. Verse 2, all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check and with a bridle. So there's this one group he wants to say something special to, but it's not just them, it's everybody. So problematic teaching is addressed, but then so are all forms of sinful and harmful speech. Right? So easily we can create an easy list. Lying or deception, abusive speech, probably things like gossip, which Scripture commands against, slander. Here's one for you. How about snarkiness? Like sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's really hurtful. We never talk about the sin of snarkiness, do we? And we're all like, oh man, I gotta watch my mouth this afternoon. But that's what happens. We throw out those barbs, and it's kind of funny, but it's really hurtful. And James is saying, pay attention to the disproportionate power of that tiny little thing in your mouth called your tongue. All of us. Everyone. We sort of worked some of these into acceptable sins. That's the snarkiness one, right? Here's another one. Gossip disguised as prayer requests. Anybody ever get one of those? Oh, we need to pray for this family. Did you hear about what their son did? I'll be happy to tell you if you haven't. We know all about this kind of stuff, don't we? Like we want to sound all spiritual, but we also want to, like, we've got the juicy news, and we want to be the ones who tell. But gossip's a sin, and we know that, so we'll pray for you. And James wants us to remember the disproportionate, destructive power of that little part of our body that's inside of our mouths. This kind of stuff creates division in the church. It can drive people away from the life of the church. And it can always be done in healthier ways. It can be done better. So, think about a situation, and we probably all can bring things like this to mind, where something happened at church. Somebody said something, and maybe it wasn't the wisest thing in the world. But it wasn't that bad. But somebody got offended and made a thing. Years ago, they would have called somebody. Now we'll just, did you hear what so-and-so said? We'll text them. That's called triangulation. And it's not healthy. What if instead, if it really was worth having a conversation about, a lot of things we just shouldn't even, just let it go. Hold your tongue. It doesn't matter. But, something came up in Sunday school and we were confused. So, let's just have a phone call later in the afternoon. Or maybe we'll grab coffee Tuesday. And I could say, hey, you said this in Sunday school. I didn't quite understand. It wasn't really clear. I was a little confused about how that relates to this other thing in the Bible. Help me out. Would you rather have someone have that conversation with you or say, I heard what you said and I think you're wrong? Which one's better for the church or the Sunday school class, small group? You don't do this job for 20 years every week without occasionally misspeaking. And there are plenty of Sundays I get home and think, man, I wish I'd put that a little differently, or that wasn't quite the right way to say that, or I misspoke, or something like that. And sometimes you might get home to lunch and say, did you really hear that thing, that weird thing the preacher said? What was that about? There's two ways to come at that, right? Go back to your small group and talk about the weird thing the preacher said. Is that healthy for the church? Or you can just call me. Hey, Pastor, you said something Sunday. I'm not quite sure. I think I misunderstood. I'm not sure. How does that relate to this other thing Jesus said? Help me out. And I'd love to have that conversation with you. If you come in and go, why'd you say that? I'm probably going to feel a little bit hesitant. But this goes for all of us, doesn't it? In every one of these situations in the life of the church, misunderstandings, sometimes we just get it wrong, but there's always a strategy for healthy growth. Can you help me understand? I didn't quite get it. It's probably me. Is there space there for all of us to grow together in Jesus? In contrast to a harsh word of critique that just divides the body of Christ. The way we use our tongues is directly related to the health of the church, the unity of the church, and the effectiveness of the church. That's why James takes it so seriously. So seriously. People leave churches and never come back because sometimes we say something off the cuff that's hurtful. We don't even notice they never come back a lot of the time. I don't want to be responsible for somebody walking away from Jesus because I can't control my mouth. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is helpful. Bonhoeffer was a German pastor and theologian in the early to mid 1900s. Some of you may have read biographies about him. He's rather well known. He was active in World War II with some of the resistance movies and was actually put to death by the Nazis because he was a part of an attempt to assassinate Hitler. So there's a pastor theologian for you. Bonhoeffer wrote a lot of stuff about Christian community and how you organize and cultivate healthy Christian community, and he had some things to say about the way Christians speak to one another. So here's a quote that I think will be helpful to us. He said it this way: it must be a decisive rule. So here's the rule. It must be a decisive rule of every Christian fellowship. I think we have one of those, right? Must be a decisive rule of every Christian fellowship that each individual is prohibited from saying much that occurs to him. How good is that? Bonhoeffer's like, you want a healthy church? Bite your tongue. You want an effective church? Shut your mouth. You want a strong church? You want a unified church? Prohibit saying much that occurs. Just because you think it doesn't mean you have to say it. Amen? And we're all like, that's true for other people, not me. But this is how it works, isn't it? We'll call it the ministry of holding the tongue. And imagine how many hurtful conflicts in church could have been avoided if we take his advice. And here's the thing. If we're focused on the barbs in relation to another, the conflict, the jabs, we're not going to be focused on evangelism. The ministry of holding the tongue is incredibly good for helping the church focus on ministries like evangelism and discipleship and missions. The ministry of holding the tongue enables the church to be about the business of the gospel and puts us in a position not to detract from the credibility of the gospel. Bonhoeffer gets that. It may be surprising to a lot of us, but we don't have to say everything that comes into our heads. And the church potentially might be much better off if we did. Bonhoeffer also understands that a disciplined tongue is directly related to our spiritual maturity, to our spiritual growth, to our sanctification, to our increasing Christ-likeness. He puts it this way: we combat our evil thoughts most effectively if we absolutely refuse to allow them to be expressed in words. So let's go back to that I feel like I can't help it posture. I'm angry, the thought pops in my head, I say it before I realize it. Bonhoeffer says, if you want to get free from having the thoughts, practice not saying them. Let's think about that for a second. So here I am. I'm quick to criticize or lash out with my mouth, but I feel convicted. The Spirit of God's like, that's a sin, stop it. So I say, well, you'll have to help me. A few minutes later, somebody does something but the Spirit's been talking to me. I've been reading James. The means of grace are there. All right. I'll offer myself to Jesus in this moment. I thought it. I won't say it this time. The next day, something else happens. I start, but I remember yesterday, the Spirit helped me in a moment like this. And I find it just a little bit easier to offer myself to Jesus again in the power of the Spirit and not say the very bad thing that's in my head that I would very much like to say. Later that afternoon, because this kind of stuff happens frequently, doesn't it? Someone does something or something happens and I have that thought and it's getting very close to my vocal cords. But I remember the Spirit helped me. Jesus is helping me. I don't have to say it. And that happens again and again and again. And every time, I get a little more like Jesus. Because he's gracious. Because he helps me. Guess what happens? Eventually, if the thoughts are not indulged, they stop coming. It's called the renewal of your mind. Paul talks about it in Romans 12. If I indulge the evil thoughts, they'll come as rapidly as they can. If I refuse to allow them to be expressed in words, I go to battle against them, evil thoughts. So again, massive implications for this taming the tongue thing. Church unity is at stake. Credibility of the gospel is at stake. The effectiveness of the mission is at stake. And my own personal growth in grace is at stake. Because if we're going to start talking about, like, sanctification is that process where the Spirit of God makes us more like Jesus. If we're talking about my sanctification, this is part of his saving work. He died to save me from the consequences of my sins, the hell, and the power of them. He died to save me so that I don't have to indulge those evil thoughts and articulate them anymore. We don't talk like this very much, do we? Jesus died to save me from lots of things, different types of rebellions and transgressions and sins, and one of them is an untamed tongue. If slander is a sin, if gossip is a sin, and Jesus died to save me from sin, one of the reasons Jesus died is to save my tongue. We'd rather him just save our souls. Leave our tongues to us. But this is the thing. This is it. This is what he's done. His body was broken. His blood was shed so that I don't have to say that vengeful thing to my spouse or my kids or my colleagues or anyone. That's nitty-gritty atonement theory, I think. Like Jesus is meddling in parts of my life I'd probably rather he just stay out of. But that's why he did it. He did it to find all those places and heal them. And he did it because so much is at stake. We are at stake. The mission is at stake. The credibility of the gospel is at stake. Jesus died so I could stop hurting people with my tongue. Jesus died so I could stop hurting people with my tongue. Does that put this kind of stuff in a different category? Does that increase the sense of gravity when we talk about the way we speak to each other? And when, by God's grace, I stop hurting people with my tongue, everything else I say about Jesus will be more credible, more believable, because my behaviors will align with my speech. That's called integrity, it's called consistency, and it's crucial for the life and the mission of the church. So James encourages us to cultivate single-minded tongues. Earlier in James, he talked about being double-minded. So a double-minded person is tossed around. They say they love Jesus, and they do sometimes, but they get distracted into sinful patterns with frequency. So there's this vigilance he calls for in the beginning of this book to be singly focused on Jesus. Just Jesus. Eyes on Jesus, 100%. My whole heart is his. But James understands that our mouths are really good indicators of whether or not we're singly focused on Jesus. Take a look at verse 9. Verse 8. No one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse those who are made in the likeness of God. With it we sing praises to God, and we tear down people in our families. We bless the Lord and Father and curse those who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and brackish water? So James says, don't have a forked tongue. You know what kind of animals have forked tongues, right? That's not where we want to be, is it? Let's not speak out of both sides of our mouths. This is what he's calling for. And he's exhorting the church because the grace of God is sufficient to make it so. The grace of God is sufficient to make it so. I was reading through this week, and that language of blessing and cursing came along. I couldn't help but think of Abraham. Genesis, Old Testament. God shows up, says, Abraham, I got a mission for you and your family. Abraham says, I don't have a family. God says, I'll take care of that. Here's the mission. I'm going to make your family a blessing to all the families of the earth. I'm going to make your family a blessing to all the families of the earth. God gives Abraham a family. His family grows. They go into slavery. God rescues them. One member of Abraham's family is named Jesus. It's a descendant of Abraham. Jesus took the Abraham family and opened it up to folks like us who weren't originally part of it. Non-Jews, Gentiles, so that we, the nations from their perspective, are brought into Abraham's family. What was the vocation of Abraham's family? To bless all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth. That's our vocation. The vocation of the people of God has been, since Genesis, to bless all the families of the earth. The way we use our speech directly impacts whether or not we embody that vocation. Will my mouth articulate the vocation of the family of Abraham and the mission of God? Or will it curse those who are made in the likeness, the image of God? The good news is the Son of God was wounded so that I could stop wounding people with my tongue. Jesus was pierced by thorns and nails so that we could stop piercing people with our words. And when we do, the church flourishes and the mission succeeds.